Hello, History Class 820. This will be a lecture entitled Historiography and the Great Awakening. It is designed for an upper-level undergraduate course entitled A Survey of the Great Awakening in Colonial History. Hello, students of Survey of the Great Awakening in Colonial America. As we move on, I think it is appropriate to look at how historians have interpreted the Great Awakening. To refresh everyone's memories, let us start with understanding what we mean by historiography. Historiography, in the simplest terms, can be described as an overview and analysis of the various interpretations of a historical topic written by past historians. Truman makes an important distinction that history is complex, and no single historian alone can capture all of its complexity. History is therefore selective, and selectivity is often shaped by the historian. Just like one can look at the various themes in a play or TV show, one can also look at the various interpretations of history unfolding throughout history. However, often not, historiography becomes contentious when scholars or groups of scholars fight over interpretations and assertions. In this regard, there are always fringe or radical interpretations, but also interpretations that are generally agreed upon. The Great Awakening is no different. I would like to therefore spend the greater part of this video talking about some of the more contentious interpretations of the Great Awakening. Some questions I would like you to keep in back of your minds while I am going forward is, do these interpretations help us find a middle ground? Do they help give an assessment of the importance of the Great Awakening or lack thereof in American history? Do they help us as a society understand the lasting legacy of the Great Awakening? The Great Awakening achieved most of its history and notoriety through newspaper recordings up and down the colonies, as well as the personal journals of the people who experienced the revivals for themselves. One of the most important being Joseph Tracy's The Great Awakening, A History of the Revivals of Religion in the Time of Edwards and Whitefield, first published in 1842, or the much later Some Aspects of the Religious Life of New England, published in 1897. This is where the personal diary of Nathan Cole can be found and his very personal and profound religious experiences. However, apart from some published works of the sermons of Whitefield or Edwards, the Great Awakening did not pick up a large portion of historical analysis until really Miller in 1933. And even then, significant interpretations and analysis did not kick up until the 1960s. John Miller in 1933 argued that the social unrest in New England and the Great Awakening must be analyzed together. For Miller, the outburst of political insurrection and unrest was spurred by the religious zeal. Miller points to Davenport, the radical New Light minister, who on 6 March 1743 created a book burning of Puritan divines he considered to be unholy. For Miller, then, the Great Awakening is a schism or fracturing of both church and society. He argued it was a lower-class rebellion pitted against the merchant classes and aristocrats. Picking up where Miller left off, another contentious debate was stirred in the 1960s when Perry Miller in 1961 published an essay entitled From Covenant to Revival. In this essay, Miller asserts colonists were not led to the revolution by Enlightenment ideals, but instead by what they saw as a decline in morality in both the colonies and the English crown. The awakening created the language of covenant, judgment, and collective accountability. In this regard, the revolution was a spiritual purge to free the colonists from a corrupt and despotic English crown. Revolution, therefore, can be traced from the pious tradition of political rebellion, moral reformation, and patriotic resistance. Miller's essay would spark the discourse that the Great Awakening was a precursor and as a leading factor leading the colonists towards the Revolutionary War. However, Allen Hymart took Miller's thoughts and pushed them even further, sparking debate and contention from both religious and secular scholars. His 1966 book, Religion in the American Mind, From the Great Awakening to the Revolution, focused largely on radical Calvinist language and theology as paving the way towards the Revolution. For Weimar, liberalism in the colonies was very conservative. Therefore, it was not a driving force towards the revolution. It was Edward's form of Calvinism which gave America an intrinsic mix of ideology, radical ideology, democratic thought, and unique religious experience, which thrust the America towards what he calls collective nationalism. This rebellious spirit had a long line of history tracing all the way back to the Puritans and their desire to purify the church. The need to purify the church society then lent itself well to the idea of the colonies purging themselves from the despotic and evil monarch in England. Miller also argued it was after the revivals of the 1740s where divisions grew stronger between the colonists and Great Britain, as well as divisions within the church, especially as radical theology took hold. Almost 40 years later, Christian scholars such as Dreisbach and Mark David Hall argued the political literature at the time before the Revolution was largely religious and contained more references to the Bible than the Enlightenment. They even focused on how many of the founders came from churches who preached or adhered to Calvinist thought. However, Edmund Morgan, 1 year after Weimar, in his work Puritan Work Ethic and the American Revolution, argued instead for secular Puritanism as a driving factor towards the Revolution. He focused instead on virtue and work ethic as unifying the colonies. So far we have looked at Miller's class rebellion and Weimar's assertion of radical Calvinist theology and language stemming from the Great Awakening as causation towards the Revolutionary War. This certainly puts a lot of meaning in the Great Awakening and its effect on the unfolding of American history. However, and a very big however here, there is one scholar who is not satisfied with Miller's, Weimar's, or even Edmund Morgan's view on the Great Awakening. The author is John Butler, who in 1982 wrote Enthusiasm Described and Decreed, The Great Awakening as Interpretive Fiction. For Butler, the Great Awakening at its best made only minor changes to any social dynamics of colonial America. For Butler, the revivals were sporadic at best and did not in the slightest unify the colonies, especially towards the Revolutionary War. Butler even adds that the awakenings only took place in what he calls the backwaters of Western society. However, Butler goes even further, saying that historians and even the Great Awakening preachers such as Edwards or Whitefield tried to make the revivals much, much more than they were. Butler even attacks new denominational growth in America stemming from the Great Awakening, arguing they only come from population growth and not from the revivals. For Butler, the Awakening authors used newspapers as a form of self-promotion, which later historians would pick up and make the Great Awakening much more than it was. Lambert in 2001 picked up where Butler left off. Lambert, however, argues that the Great Awakening is not interpretive fiction, but is a wholly cultural invention. He argues that the revivalists used newspapers and correspondence and written accounts to advance what he calls their cultural construction and an imagined community. It is here where we will end. We have two varying spectrums on the Great Awakening interpretation. On one end, we have the Great Awakening as a radical event unifying the colonies and using Calvinist theology and language to purge the colonies from a despotic government and leading towards the Revolution. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the view that the Great Awakening was nothing more than interpretive fiction or a cultural invention for preachers and historians to make the Great Awakening much more than it was, or as a means of pure self-promotion for the preachers. Taking both radical and fringe views and analyzing them, perhaps there is some middle ground. Certainly, Heimart took some liberty with what he called reading between the lines, and Butler seems to have left out the many personal experiences and thousands who showed up to hear the preachers preach. So was the Great Awakening the major cause of the Revolutionary War? Most likely not. Was it pure interpretive fiction as posed by Butler? Once again, most likely not. For example, many such as Nathan Cole had very real and very profound personal and spiritual experiences by the preachings, and they wrote about them for the later historians to pick up. Even current historians such as David Hall and Dreisbeck do point to the religious language of the founders and how they were very much influenced from the Bible. The Great Awakening had some very real and some great significance. However, the amount of significance is still debated among scholars. I would like to close with the questions I posed at the beginning. Do these interpretations help us find a middle ground? Do they give an assessment of the importance of the Great Awakening in American history? Do they help us as a society understand the lasting legacy of the Great Awakening? And which ways do you think the Great Awakening should be remembered? Lastly, for your upcoming discussion board, I want you to consider which interpretation you agree with and which ones you find fault with. Thank you very much.